exciting times. As usual, the weather is a little wacky. I think we're on record now for the third coldest February on record at SeaTac. Los Angeles, the first February on their record where they have not reached 70 degrees at all this month. And in London on Tuesday, it did get to be 70 degrees, and that was an all-time record in London. And so all this weather has us on the fringe, thinking about the climate, thinking about our forests, thinking about the importance of science in the woods. And I had the pleasure of meeting about a decade ago Dr. Michael Medler. I was teaching environmental journalism at Huxley, and he's an esteemed professor there. And I remember Mike telling me very early on about the management problems in America's forests, and warning that we were going to have a serious human-forest interface problems in the future because of what was happening geographically and climatically. And so when we had our 2016 forest fire here, I thought, Michael Medler. When Sonoma caught fire, I thought, Michael Medler. When Paradise, California burned down, I thought, Michael Medler. And he's graciously agreed to come down from Huxley College of the Environment at Western Washington University to speak with us tonight. He is a professor. He is president of the Association for Fire Ecology. He is the founding editor of the scientific journal Fire Ecology. He speaks widely, including testimony to Congress, and he has a very outdoor background. We were learning even more about it this evening. But he worked the fire crews for the big Yellowstone fires in '88. He worked at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. He tried to swim a portion of the Colorado River and spent an hour in a whirlpool going around and around and around. So we know that he's a really smart guy. Dr. Medler is also an avid mountain climber. He's been involved in search and rescue in the North Cascades, very cognizant of our surroundings here. So Mike, come on up and please, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Bill. I might try to go without this. I'm known to be the loudest person around, so if you're in the back and you're not hearing me, go ahead and give me a nod and I'll go back to the mic. But yeah, thank you for inviting me. What you have going on here is, I won't say entirely unique, but in great many ways it really is, as far as the scale of what you're trying to do with the forest in coordination with the city and with the community. And I really want to applaud the efforts you're going through here, and really wish we could see a lot more of that going on in a bunch of other towns in the Pacific Northwest and California and Arizona. I'll get to all that. I'm giving a talk on pyrogeography, a word I made up with some friends a long time ago, which is just simply fire and geography, for those of you that forgot your Latin classes. And what I want to do is give you an annoyingly large amount of information and numbers, and like when I give stats lectures to my students, I say, don't worry about the numbers, I'm just using them for my notes, you know, and I'll explain what I mean when I'm waving around numbers and equations or whatever. So yeah, don't get your college anxiety going here. I'll keep that for the students. Now let me see if this device, we've got it. No? So yeah, as Bill said, a long time ago, I used to work for fire crews. In the mid-'80s, clouds of pterodactyls darkening the skies. I was a firefighter, young little kid, and ended up at a bunch of fires, including Yellowstone in '88, which was in many ways a real turning point in American wildland fire, because there weren't very many people in the fire business that remembered anything like that. The last year where we'd had big fires like Yellowstone was beyond people's memories. You know, the 20s and the 30s and the 10s, there had been big fires, but America had kind of forgotten about it. My job as a fire crew member actually started in April, and I wasn't really a firefighter. Most of my job involved a torch in my hands burning up clear cuts after they had been thinned and cleared. My job was to go in and burn them up. So all summer, we were the crew that knew how to use torches, so we got to do all the fun stuff, like lighting stuff in Yellowstone. This little thing that we lit off in Yellowstone, for example, got away from us and burned down to Old Faithful Lodge a day before the fire was supposed to get there, and I wasn't supposed to talk about it for 20 years, and that's a whole other fun war story. Fire crews are fun stuff. And, yeah. Didn't get the Old Faithful, we were good. And I had a lot of great experiences, and some of my best friends in my life still come from that time. This fellow, Andy, pulled me out a couple times in mild situations, and one time I had the full-on firefighter thing down on the ground saying, this is it, hose still in my hand, thinking I might be able to pull it off, but no, I'm burned over. He runs in, grabs me by the ankles and stuff like this, and drags me through these kinds of logs, and I'm unconscious at that point, and wow, that was a really close call. And it happens, it's a business like that, and it's dangerous, and so fun. But yeah, we were in a situation where we're seeing more and more of these very, very sad, we don't want to tear up stuff, which we shouldn't be seeing as much of. And that's a whole other set of discussions about safety procedures and processes. But what I want to say is, when my children were growing up, I was always telling them what a great time being on a fire crew was. And I was telling my children that this would be a great way to pay your way through college, some of the best times of my life. And this is my daughter, Bodie. This is her senior year in high school. She's at the Highland Games tossing cavers. She had the Seaholm High School weightlifting records on 3 or 4 different weights. She was a powerful young woman. And she knew how to bring her own headlamp and had been sleeping in the dirt since the day she was born. In other words, a perfect firefighter. This is exactly who they're looking for. And by the time she turned 18, I wasn't saying, hey honey, you should think about firefighting. I was kind of getting that parental, I don't know. I'd rather you took up rock climbing or something. And part of it, just part of the big picture, was changes that have been happening over the last 20, 30 years since I was doing this stuff. When I was a firefighter, we were very specifically trained that if the fire was doing anything interesting, run away. The Monty Python thing was our thing. Anytime, whoa, run away! We would all run away. And that works really well if you have fire crew who know what's going on, understand fire weather, and know what behavior means what, and has good overheads so that the new folks are learning and being mentored. And I'm not convinced it's working that way quite as much anymore, for a bunch of reasons. And a lot of them look like this. That you're a fire crew, and there's a fire, it's coming at $1 million house, you're going to make slightly different decisions. I was working in wilderness areas in backcountry, and very seldom around homes and structures. But when we did, which we did occasionally, everything shifted. And just even subconsciously, you wanted to help. You wanted to keep people's houses, and it makes you make dumb decisions. Like, we were trained to run away from anything over 6 feet tall. If it's 6 feet tall and it's coming at you, you're in the wrong place. And now this is sort of the stuff you see all the time now in wildland firefighting, is firefighters making one desperate stand to save the tiny chicken shack back there and stuff. And that's why when you see, the fatalities, I don't know if anyone's seen the movie about the Yarnell Hill, the 19 people who were, oh, there's the tears. Good movie. Nah, okay movie. Interesting story. But yes, we've got this thing going on where people are getting hurt, and that's a whole nother story. But what's the context? I moved here to Bellingham, about 18 years ago, and I arrived here as a fire ecologist, a fire scientist, and everybody was really apologetic and sorry to me. They'd always say, bummer, we don't have fires. These are asbestos forests. We haven't had fires here in recorded history. And I had heard all that over and over and over. The first day I got to the fire in Yellowstone, the biologist in Yellowstone came out and met my crew. We were one of the first ones there, and they said, sorry to make you folks all come out here. We haven't had big fires here in recorded history. This is an asbestos forest. Yellowstone can't burn. And they kept that line until we hit about 500,000 acres, and then they started shifting. And so whenever I hear people talking about, this can't burn, I go, oh, I get what you're saying. Here's the Olympics. But yeah, I had a student on this fire a couple years ago. Even that was burning on a not tremendously crazy dry situation. So one of my sort of shticks. You ever see this old movie? The engineer at one point, the owner's like, but it's unsinkable. He's like, it's made of metal. It's got a hole in it. It's gonna sink. And so part of my job at this point is to go, have you looked at the woods? Do you know what they're made of? Wood. They can burn. not only can, all right, here's the big take-home message that I know you all know intellectually, they will. Your woods, the woods, all the woods will burn. As a geographer, I'm into scale, and that doesn't mean space. But yeah, maybe not for 1,000 years, right? But yes, it's one of those things, great certainty. Things made out of wood will burn, there will be lightning, there will be dry summers. Stuff is going to burn, just like metal ships will sink if you put holes in it. When you live in a place where fires may only occur every 500 or 1,000 years, that's real easy to forget. Now, you're in a special little climate hole. We could talk for hours about the fun of this. But on those mountains over there, that big wet side, go up to places that get 100 inches of rain a year. Yeah, they've traditionally, over the last 10,000 years, had fires every 500 to 1,000 years. As you know, it's not that wet here as it is there. You're in a kind of special little spot with special kinds of ecosystems, and we can talk a bit more about that. But in the broad picture, yeah, Washington is no longer laboring under the illusion that it's a fireproof state. We've noticed that there is 5/6 of the state on the other side of the mountains. They've always known they were dry over there. You didn't have to convince them, right? Here on the west side, we sort of capitalized this whole idea, Washington, rainy state. But we're having big problems, big problems. We've had a couple years where we've broken records and then doubled those records again, and the acreages of fire burning here in Washington. You've had a fire here, just in your own system here, and just a couple years ago, we had a fire in the last summer up in the Chuckanuts outside of Bellingham that burned up right near some people's houses. Familiar stuff. Now, usually, until this year when I've given this talk, I've often talked about, and someday there'll be a fire in California that will burn thousands of homes, and everything will change once we're paying attention, once the insurance industry, I don't know. I think it's going to take more, apparently. I'm still sort of in the policy arena. Yes, California is a bit more mobilized, but it sounds like crickets. Big changes? I'm not hearing it. Out of something that burned up thousands of homes, killed close to 100 people. I have colleagues in the resilience and disaster research business that say nothing ever changes till that number is 100 on a disaster. For some reason, Americans have until you see 3 numbers, who could do anything about it? That's another research agenda. And it's ended up with people like me, and usually a bunch of old, gray-bearded white men sitting around in Congress saying, oh, what's to do? Oh, where's the money? What do we do next? And that's kind of what I'm here to talk about. I've had to go in and testify and try to bring fire ecology and firefighting paradigm structure changes to a lot of different politicians. And once again, things like firefighter accidents, that gets a lot of attention, and it should. And I've had students do a bunch of research, and we've looked at a bunch of this stuff, and you know, for the folks getting burned up, there's actually heart attacks a big one, and actually aircraft accidents and vehicle accidents. In my experience on fire crews, most of the people I know that got hurt were in trucks when it happened. You know, there's a bunch of stories on that. But we've had a bunch of incidents, a bunch of people have been burned or killed and whatnot. And one of the things my students wanted to check was, is that really happening out in the backcountry, or is it happening here? The wildland-urban interface, WUI, one of the phrases we use. And the short answer is, this chart was made before Yarnell Hill. There's 19 more dots up there. But, largely speaking, calamities with firefighters in the United States happen disproportionately within the last quarter mile around homes and houses and structures, is sort of the short answer. So yeah, we've got a firefighting problem, we've got a fire problem in these areas near where people live. Now once again, they're just graphs. I'll talk you through them, don't freak out. I'm used to very anxious freshmen in a stats class, anxiety. But yeah, it's just a graph. And it's going up. And it's acres burned in the United States and money spent. And go figure, when we burn more acres, we spend more money. And yes, these are numbers going back, hey, there's 88. The biggest fires here ever, the most money. We haven't, we hardly ever had years as little as this big shift year, when everything shifted. So, there's a lot going on. And it's being driven by a lot of phenomena. And I would say these are probably the 3 that are driving the problems and issues we're having with wildland fire, which is largely issues with climate change, a whole century of fire policies we'll talk about, and rapid development. In the last 20 to 40 years, we have put tens of, literally, close to 100 million people living out in these areas that are fire prone. And your community is on a list like that. On the climate change stuff, we're seeing sort of a whole new dialogue here in the last couple of years. This is a Today headline. This whole waving of arms and, well, uncertainty. Whole groups of scientists now use numbers like there's less than a 1 in a million chance. The changes we've seen in the last couple decades are not driven by human anthropogenic change to the atmosphere. The subject of other fine talks. Fire responds to that. Now, when you're fighting a fire, say in 1988 in Yellowstone, subtle differences can make all the difference. When the air humidity was about 14%, relative humidity, we'd be head down, digging, making fire, we'd be running chainsaws. Somebody every 20 minutes, swinging a swing slicometer, that's a word for it, trying to measure the humidity. And if it got to about 13, they'd get on the radio, we got 13, it's only 13. I'm like, oh shit, sorry. And we'd be packing up, putting stuff in. And then the radio, 12 and a half, 12 and a half. Like, okay, getting ready, and it's 12! And boom, a forest fire would jump off the floor where it was burning through stuff, and within minutes it would jump into the understory and get in the crown and go 20 miles an hour. It was, 1% relative humidity. And so the point of this story is people get, 2 degrees, which is Celsius, by the way, which is a lot more than Fahrenheit. These little differences can make a huge difference. And one of the big differences we see in the fire business is fire season is months longer than most of the West. I don't walk you through this, but basically, when I was a firefighter, you went to work on the 4th of July and you were done on September 20th. Nowadays, out here it's April till October, and in California it's a 12-month job. This is new. The lengths of the season, the lengths of the droughts, the temperatures, the humidities are in a kind of whole new realm. Now here's a fun paper that just came out. These folks looked at the most likely climate change models over the next 50 so years and said, where would you have to drive today to see what your climate's going to be like in 50 years? And so they produced all these lovely maps. Like if you want to know what Washington, D.C. is going to be like, you'd have to go down here. Now, I went too far. Check this one out. There's a map that shows Portland. And what this map is saying is within 50 years, the weather in Portland, Oregon, that's Paradise, California, right just north of that valley. And that should send shivers through people who are in charge of fires around Portland. Right? This map really caught my attention in a very big way. The maps get complicated. There's a bunch of dots and a bunch of lines, and they didn't make a nice zoom in, so I zoomed in on theirs. But what you see here, once again, there's Portland moving down here, Seattle moving down past Portland, and us all blobbed up there. Now the good news here is these sorts of models aren't indicating those kinds of vast changes right here. So Seattle's dropping maybe 200 miles south. You get north of Seattle, they're basically what we're looking at is maritime climate. Thank goodness the ocean's saving us once again, as it often does with the weather here. So maybe we're not looking at the same magnitude of change. But just outside Seattle, the hills up above Seattle, Issaquah, places like that, freak me out. Whenever I drive over there and I look at that development up Sacramento, up in Issaquah, all I can think of is the Oakland Hills. It looks just like the Oakland Hills before a bunch of houses burned up in there in the 90s. Now, where am I going? Yes, okay. You've got us freaked out, Medler, now what? All right, so things are changing. Fires are going to happen more. They're going to burn hotter. They're going to burn bigger. They're going to be more frequent. We're in a spot where those changes might make a big difference to us. In the North Cascades, for example, we have traditionally had fires every 500 or so years. Eugene, Oregon, has fires every 50 years. So what we're looking at is a shift, possibly in these areas, but just a couple hundred miles of latitude that can make a huge difference in the kinds of fires we should expect. Now, in 2002, the federal government stepped in to try to solve these problems. It wasn't like we are the first people to think about it, but this has been being worried about for a long time. Here's a lovely cartoon from when the Bush administration first proposed the Healthy Forest Initiative, and I think this cartoon captures the era pretty well. If there weren't these darn trees, we wouldn't have forest fires. Now, the Healthy Forest Initiative set up a set of parameters that are still working through our policy arena at this point. And just to put it bluntly, there were billions of dollars available to try to mitigate fire damage as long as the lands were federal lands near communities. And they were federal lands that had had fire suppression change their ecosystem. The catch is very few places fit that description, right? How many federal lands are nestled right up against towns? That's actually a pretty unusual situation. Flagstaff, you know, a couple places. Yeah, it's a very unusual situation. So the monies weren't available. A lot of what we're seeing now, this is the wildland-urban interface map for the state of Washington. You know, we've got these big centers and then lots of this sort of digitized stuff. And you guys are a perfect example of the stuff that doesn't show up at this scale. I won't get too zoomy in here, but a lot of you live fairly close to a forest. And a forest fire coming out of the forest could get pretty close to your house. And so you're in what we have traditionally referred to as a wildland-urban intermix or interface, where we think about, wow, what's a forest fire going to look like if it hits a community like this? Now, once again, going back to the healthy forest stuff, a couple years ago we had 500,000 acres, which we then doubled the size of the fires the next year. But these fires were a big deal out on the east side of Washington. And let's see which maps I got. And so here's some maps of their perimeters, and here's the land ownership. Now, once again, I'll wade you through this, but what you see is these are great big fires. The green stuff is federal. Whoa, whoa. Well, these fires aren't burning on federal land. So our usual approach of the federal government's got to get in and do something about their fires in their forests doesn't really apply much in this case at all. It's going to require different groups, different community members, different land ownership, people to be paying different attention. Now, once again, these are not all forests. A lot of this is grasslands and grazing lands and scrub. So it's a very complicated system that we have sort of some simplified understandings. Now, once again, simplified understandings. Most of you in the room probably know a couple things about fire that I'm happy you already know and I don't have to tell you. One is, it's a natural component of the ecosystem, right? Can I get some nodding? Thank you. Yeah, it's these forests, these plants, these bugs, these animals have all co-evolved with fire for thousands, tens of thousands of years, and it's as natural a part of these systems as oxygen. Just like tides are a natural part of tidelands. Nature's doing its thing, and fire is a big part of that thing, and there's species that can't reproduce without fire. Serotinous cones on lodgepole pines can't literally release their seeds unless they get hot enough to let the seeds out. So lodgepole pine sits there going its whole life like, I'm never going to get to reproduce. I am so lonely. And then, fire! Game on, seeds out. This is it, man. I've lived my whole life to do this thing. It's like the best thing that's ever happened to that tree. Right? So we get this kind of human perspective of fire. You know, like we see, oh, the poor salmon, he died. Well, the salmon's like, woohoo, doing my salmon thing. And a lot of forests and ecosystems have a fire thing going on that's yay, fire. We have mucked that up. And this is the other thing most of you know. There are these stories that we used to have forests that had fires burning in them, and then we stopped the fires, and fuels could then grow up underneath these trees. And so if we stopped fires for too many years, we'd have these what we call ladder fuels, and then when a fire does come in, it burns everything and kills even the overstory. This is a great story, and it's true in a lot of places. It's particularly true in Flagstaff, Arizona, Twist, places like that. Not very true in Western Washington. Once again, we don't have fires that often out here, so our systems aren't, shall we say, co-evolved with a 4-year fire return interval. So yes, that's true, and on the east side we've seen profound changes. We've been fighting fires out here and grazing, and over 100 years we've switched, and all these areas that used to burn and burn and burn now have continuous forest in here. And the people that live there and work there would be horrified to see this all burn up again, but for 10,000 years these systems were probably large mosaic patches of burned and unburned stuff, and 100 years of fire suppression, we've got fairly continuous fuels with built up ladder fuels. And once again, you put a lightning strike out in here, and there's all sorts of burned up spots, you're not going to burn up that much. You have an entire county of the same age and size forest, there's nothing to stop the fire. So you get much bigger patches. So that's one of these things we're seeing is big fires. When I was a firefighter, 40,000 acres was massive. Unbelievably big. That doesn't make the newspapers anymore. 400,000, 500,000, we start talking about, hey, maybe someone in another city's heard of this fire, right? We don't tell people in acres anymore. Notice in the last 2 years, we switched to square miles. That's interesting. Not from these guys. That's a whole different kind of ballbacks. So yes, this story is true in a great many places. Fire suppression has left us vulnerable to new system-changing fires. When you have a fire in an area that burns differently than it did historically, you're going to change that area. Now, as a manager, you may be okay with that or not. Generally, people aren't. But there's a lot of debates that we're going to have. Now, tree ring records, right? You go up on, I know where I hike around up in Bellingham, we see these fire scars. I've got cedar trees I go take to people with 3, 4 fire scars on them in the chuckanuts, where I've been told over and over, there's never been fires up there. So, interesting. Can I take a walk with you, sir? Show you some trees. Yes, there's been fires. And these let us do the fire ring analysis of when fires occurred. And this is what you see over a lot of the American West. Fire, 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 fire. This is 1896. This is 1994. Fire's been going every couple of years, and then boom, 100-year rest from fire. Now there's climate reasons, but mostly there's management reasons. And not just firefighting, a lot of it's grazing. By eliminating the fuels on the forest floor, we've put fires from moving around in ways that on the east side in Arizona and California they used to happen. And so there is this story, and it's true. This is the kind of ladder fuels you see. My girlfriend and I, when I was on fire crew, went to Yellowstone a couple months before the fires, just as a coincidence. And whenever we'd hike around, all we could say was, you know what this place needs is a good fire. Because it was stacked. You couldn't move. I'm going to go hiking through the forests. You know, every 60th tree was bigger than your wrist, and it was just completely crowded out. All right, so let me do some numbers with you. Just roll with me again. So if we weren't suppressing, if we weren't out there fighting fires, one of the sort of big baseline questions as a scientist I want to know is, how much fire would be going on? And this is because of this idea of a fire regime. A given forest, a given place, has a long historical fire regime of how often fires burn, how hot they burn, and how big of patches. And whether they burn up everything or they just burn the understory. These are the things that make up a fire regime. And when you quit having fire, you change the fire regime such as I said. So the next fire is going to come in and really change stuff. So one of these sort of baseline things that we didn't used to be able to do is say, well, what should we expect? And about a decade ago, a bunch of colleagues of mine got a great big grant and went out and mapped the entire United States at little 30-meter squares for a bunch of things like vegetation communities and fire regimes. And all of a sudden we had data. You say, well, what would these systems look like if we weren't busy fighting fire? So I got a bunch of students, we groveled in, and you go to these websites and you download the data, and you get data like this. This is the one I'm going to talk about. Mean fire return interval. Bunch of colors. These colors mean, on average, mouthful, think about it. Areas that are these colors have fires every 11 to 15 years. Areas that are these colors, every 500. And we'll zoom in and talk a little bit more about Washington more specifically, but we've got all the above. Down in the American South here, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, they've got a lot of these colors. This is this stuff. The American South is used to burning the ecosystems there every couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years. If you zoom into Washington once again, this gives us a chance to say, well, in a given area, say around Anacortes or say around Asotin, the forest there, how often did they traditionally burn before we were doing firefighting? Now, say we have a couple of these spots, these little zones, and I have, let's call them 10-hectare plots. So, you know, it's about the same as 14 football fields, kind of the amount of land you can get up and throw rocks on and not hurt anybody. And these areas have these kinds of fire return intervals. This spot has always had about a 10-year fire return. This is about a 50. This is a 250. And this is kind of the west side of the Cascades. You go up in some places, you'll have 250, 500 years. Down in dry spots, you might have these kinds of numbers. And what this means, so follow me here with the math. If this stuff is going to burn every 10 years, then the annual average is about an acre a year, right? Every 10 years it all burns, so if over 100 years you do the average. So that's about 1 hectare this one 50 years, so only like 0.2, this every 250 years, so a tiny number that rounds almost to 0. So you add that all up, and on average, over the long term, a little over a hectare a year is what we should expect. Now, the fires don't come in a nice little interval every year. They may wait 30, 40 years and boom, you get a big fire. But at an ecosystem level, this is the pulse. This is the system staying the same. And if you change that number, if you make it burn more often or less often, you're going to change which species can live there, whether the bugs are killing things, or whether the soils are going to transport water to your water systems. So it's a big deal when you change a system like this. So once again, we did these kinds of numbers for every 30-meter pixel in the American West. So we went through with a bunch of grad students and did a bunch of numbers and did this math. Now, here's the thing to remember, though. So remember when I was talking about this, our weather might become like Portland's. Here's the sort of profound effects this stuff can have. So here, we're getting our 1.24 hectares out of this system. Now imagine this switches 200, 300 miles south and gets the weather from Eugene instead of Seattle, or the weather from outside of Portland instead of Bellingham. And you change those numbers, it has really profound effects. Now this is 1 year, 2 year, and 5 year. Quick fire return interval like east side stuff, and boom, instead of 1 and a bit, we're having 17 hectares burn every year. And this is the kind of management numbers we're seeing. East side of Washington, used to be, whoa, gosh, we got 15,000 acres this summer. Now it's like 1.2 million? Whoa, where'd that number? And it's this kind of, it's like unmanageable with multiple orders of magnitude shifts in what we're seeing. So, what's this all mean with what's going on here? Well, we have this other data. It's a pretty fun data set that also became available at the same time. We now have all of the fires. For a fire ecologist, this was like the biggest day of my life when this came out. Because we used to have to assemble data for counties and stuff like this. And once again, some people got some grants, hired a bunch of folks, dug through shoeboxes of numbers and records, and produced a data set for the entire country that has every single fire with when it started, when it ended, how big it got, and all this, giant spreadsheet. So here's Washington. I find this interesting. The big triangles are bigger fires over 1,000 acres, and you kind of see we're doing pretty good, but notice some dots up there. So this data, combined with this data, lets us now ask, are we having as many fires? Are we burning as many acres as the ecosystems require to not change into something new? What's this new? I'll give you a hint. No, that's the answer. But, so here, just once again, the numbers will show you. So what we do is we take how many acres are burning in each state, and we compare it to how many acres would have to burn to keep these ecosystems from changing to something new, which is, largely speaking, undesirable. Right? You don't want your forest to turn into a whole new kind of forest. And what I've got here, these are these mean fire hectares per year, and then these numbers are what we should expect, and so here's the deficit. So this is really just taking what we got. This many acres of fire, this is sort of the range. This is sort of our lowest and highest numbers it would take to keep these systems from changing, and boom, here's the deficit. So these are fire deficit numbers down in this column, and once again, they won't be tested later. But they're really big numbers. So 158 to 200,000 hectares each year. So this is in the state of Washington. Each year, we are having 100 or 200,000 hectares less fire than it would take to keep our ecosystems from switching and converting to something else. That's the size of Thurston County. So there's sort of one take-home number. Like every year, we're falling that far behind. Which, when I first do these numbers and the grad students, they bring in the numbers, I'm like, well, you've clearly mucked this up and got too many zeros in here. That's insane. Unfortunately, it's not. This is kind of the reality of what these ecosystems that we're living with need to be going through their natural foresty stuff. Too bad we're trying to live in it, right? So this creates some conundrums. Now, once again, I'll get to the take-home messages. Run the same numbers for the entire western United States. I'll convert that to acres. And here's some interesting sort of way to think about it. We're falling behind something like 13 to 20 million acres a year. Now, when I started firefighting, a 2 or 3 million acre summer was a big summer. Now, a 10 million acre summer is big. 12 would be like, I think, the biggest we've had in the Western United States here in a while. But we're falling behind by these crazy numbers. And when I give these at fire conferences, people are just like, Medler, what are you smoking? Like, Jesus. And they're numbers that can't be handled. You can't go out and thin and clear 20 million acres a year. You would need 1 million chainsaw gnomes working 24 hours a day. I mean, these are the kind of numbers, they're unimaginable. And I'll get to this a little further. But this is the solution that comes to my mind if you want to use chainsaws to fix numbers like this. I ran the numbers for the whole country. So once again, remember the South has this problem. Fire return intervals of every 5-6 years in many places, and this whole little phenomenon that amplifies how many acres you're going to expect. So the short of it is, once again, zoom you through the numbers, just sort of take it. But yeah, this is an insane number. We are falling 63 million acres a year behind the United States on the amount of fire that would occur in these ecosystems, and we are chopping out the cities. I am cutting out everything that has a human footprint. I'm taking all the reservoirs, I'm taking all the cities out. I'm not trying to say, I'm not using the math of pre-Columbian North America. So, once again, my colleagues often, that means you're wrong. That number doesn't fit my preconceptions. I've had papers rejected because your results don't fit our preconceptions, which as a scientist, really? That's the best you got? Okay, that's too bad. But yes, here, all the way back to 1980, these are the years, 5 million, 4 million, 2 million, 2 million, 3 million. We weren't having 20, 30 million acre summers. I did some digging though.